There comes a point where your life does not fall apart, but it stops making sense in the way it used to. Things that once felt aligned begin to feel slightly off, then increasingly heavy, until even simple routines carry a kind of quiet resistance. You are not confused about what is happening, but you cannot fully explain it either. It feels less like a problem and more like a shift that has already begun without your permission. This is where most people try to fix something that is not actually broken. What is happening is not malfunction. It is misalignment becoming visible. What makes this difficult to recognize is that nothing external has to collapse for the internal shift to begin. Your job can still be stable. Your relationships can still exist. Your daily life can still function, and yet something inside you has already started withdrawing from it. This creates a strange tension because your outer life is asking you to continue, while your inner state is no longer fully participating. You may find yourself going through the motions while feeling increasingly disconnected from what those motions used to mean. This is not apathy. It is the early stage of refusal. Most people assume that rebellion looks loud, emotional, or reactive, but the deeper form rarely presents that way. It often begins as a quiet noticing that you cannot fully return to how you used to be. You can imitate your old responses, but you cannot inhabit them with the same sincerity. This creates a subtle friction that builds over time because the system you are in expects consistency, while you are no longer internally consistent with it. The discomfort does not come from the situation alone. It comes from the growing gap between who you have been and who you are becoming. The mechanism behind this is simple, even if the experience is not. Your identity has been operating on a set of agreements that once made sense based on what you needed, what you believed, and what you were trying to maintain. Over time, those agreements begin to expire, not because you consciously reject them, but because you no longer require them to function. The problem is that your environment still responds to the version of you that made those agreements. So you are being treated according to a pattern you no longer fully embody, which creates pressure that cannot be resolved by effort alone. This is why trying harder usually makes the feeling worse instead of better. When you attempt to force alignment with something that your system has already outgrown, you create internal contradiction. Part of you continues the behavior, while another part of you withdraws energy from it. This split is what produces exhaustion, even when nothing about your external workload has changed. You are not just doing the task. You are doing the task while resisting the version of yourself that used to do it naturally. That resistance accumulates. From the outside, this phase can look like indecision or lack of discipline, but that interpretation misses what is actually occurring. You are not struggling to choose, you are struggling to pretend. The options in front of you may still be valid, but they no longer feel truthful in the same way. This creates a delay in action that is often misunderstood as hesitation, when it is actually a form of internal filtering. You are no longer willing to move in ways that require you to ignore what you are starting to see. There is also a shift in how you experience time during this process. Things that once felt neutral begin to feel like they are taking too long. Not because the duration has changed, but because your tolerance for misalignment has decreased. You become more aware of how much energy is required to sustain something that does not reflect you anymore. This awareness is not comfortable because it removes your ability to unknowingly participate. Once you see the cost, you cannot fully agree to pay it in the same way again. This is where many people try to find a clean explanation so they can regain a sense of control. They look for a clear reason, a single cause, or a specific event they can point to and say, that is why everything feels different. Sometimes there is a visible trigger, but more often the shift has been building quietly for a long time. What you are feeling now is not sudden. It is accumulated recognition reaching a point where it can no longer be ignored. The clarity did not appear overnight. It crossed a threshold. That threshold is important because it changes how your system responds moving forward. Before you could override discomfort and continue. Now, overriding comes with a noticeable cost that you cannot easily dismiss. This is where the idea of rebellion begins to take form, but it does not look like defiance against the world. It looks like an increasing inability to cooperate with what no longer fits. You are not trying to break anything. You are simply no longer able to maintain what is misaligned without feeling it immediately. In your day-to-day experience, this can show up in small but consistent ways. Conversations that once felt easy begin to feel forced. Commitments that once felt manageable begin to feel heavy before you even start them. You may notice yourself pausing more, questioning more, or withdrawing from interactions that require a version of you that feels outdated. These are not random changes in mood. They are signals that your internal reference point is shifting and your behavior is trying to catch up. What complicates this further is that your external world does not immediately adjust to your internal shift. People still expect the same responses. Systems still operate the same way. Opportunities still present themselves based on who you have been. This creates a temporary mismatch where you are being invited into roles that no longer feel accurate, while not yet having fully established what replaces them. The uncertainty here is not a lack of direction. It is the space between identities. This space often feels unstable because it removes familiar anchors without immediately providing new ones. You may feel like you are in between versions of yourself, where the old one is no longer sustainable and the new one is not fully formed. This is where many people try to rush into clarity, because the discomfort of not knowing feels harder than the discomfort of misalignment. But moving too quickly here often recreates the same pattern in a slightly different form. If you look closely, you may notice that what you are actually resisting is not the external situation alone, but the requirement to remain who you were in order to keep it. The deeper tension is not about what you are doing, it is about what you are being asked to be while doing it. Once that becomes visible, the question changes. It is no longer about how to make the situation work. It becomes about whether continuing requires you to move against your current state. This is where the rebellion becomes more defined, but still not in the way people expect. It does not require a dramatic decision or a sudden exit. It begins with a shift in what you are willing to reinforce. You may still be in the same environment, but you are no longer feeding it in the same way. Your responses change, your energy allocation changes, your level of participation changes. And because systems rely on consistency, even small changes begin to alter the dynamic. What you start to see is that your life has been partially sustained by patterns of participation that you are now interrupting. Not by force, but by absence. You are no longer giving automatic agreement to things that once ran without question. This creates a different kind of movement, where change is not initiated through action alone, but through what you stop maintaining. And as that continues, something else begins to take shape, not from what you decide to do next, but from what you are no longer able to continue. What becomes difficult here is that the mind usually wants to treat this phase as a decision problem when it is often a coherence problem instead. You may think you need a better plan, a clearer answer, or more confidence before you move. But many times what is actually happening is that your inner structure is no longer willing to organize itself around what used to be acceptable. That changes the function of thought itself. Instead of helping you commit, your thinking begins exposing the cost of commitment to what no longer fits. The result is that your own mind starts feeling less like a tool for productivity and more like a witness that keeps interrupting the old momentum. This is why clarity alone does not immediately create relief. Many people assume that once they see what is wrong, they will feel liberated, but early clarity often increases pressure before it creates freedom. The reason is simple. Once you can name the misalignment, you also lose some ability to hide from it. What was once a vague discomfort becomes a visible contradiction, and visible contradiction is harder to carry casually. You are no longer dealing only with fatigue, confusion, or resistance. You are dealing with the fact that your awareness has stopped cooperating with the story that kept everything running. You may notice something important in the way this begins to affect ordinary choices. Small things start carrying unusual weight because they are no longer being measured only by practicality. They are being measured by congruence. A conversation, a routine, a role, or a commitment may still make sense on paper, but your system is no longer evaluating it by surface logic alone. It is asking a deeper question now, even if you do not say it out loud. It is asking whether participation requires self-betrayal, whether continuation requires distortion, whether function is being purchased at the cost of truth. That question changes the entire emotional atmosphere of your life. What once felt merely tiring now begins to feel invasive. What once felt manageable now feels strangely expensive. This is not always because the outer demand increased, but because your inner willingness to subsidize misalignment has decreased. For a long time, many people survive by lending their energy to structures that do not fully reflect them. They call it discipline, responsibility, maturity, or patience. Sometimes those words are accurate, but sometimes they are only respectable names for prolonged self-abandonment. That is why this phase can be so disorienting. It does not just challenge what you are doing. It challenges what you have been calling normal. You begin to see that some of your stability was built on repeated override, on repeated silencing, on repeated agreements made for the sake of keeping the system intact. Once that becomes visible, the rebellion deepens. It is no longer only against a specific task or environment. It is against the internal arrangement that trained you to treat your own friction as something to dismiss. Most people are not prepared for how subtle this turning point can be. They imagine transformation arriving as a dramatic event, but often it first appears as a loss of appetite for the false. You start becoming less available for what drains you, not because you are trying to be difficult, but because your participation is no longer automatic. That matters. Automatic agreement is one of the strongest forces maintaining an old life. When that agreement weakens, even before any visible action is taken, the structure starts losing reinforcement from within. This is where many people misread themselves and become unnecessarily harsh. They say they are procrastinating when they are actually withdrawing false consent. They say they are lazy when they are actually losing the ability to manufacture enthusiasm for what has expired. They say they are afraid to move, when in many cases, they are finally afraid of moving in the wrong direction again. That difference matters because the language you use on yourself determines whether you interpret this phase as failure or as intelligence. One interpretation creates shame. The other creates attention. Attention is what this phase asks for more than immediate action. Not passive drifting and not endless analysis, but careful attention to what your system is refusing and why. If you rush past that, you are likely to rebuild the same structure with slightly different language and call it change. That happens all the time. A person leaves one role only to recreate the same pattern in another. A person ends one dynamic only to enter a new version of the same agreement. Without deeper attention, movement can become disguise rather than transformation. You can begin to see the mechanism more clearly if you look at how identity and behavior relate. Behavior often changes last. Identity shifts first in quieter, less visible ways. Your perception changes, your tolerance changes, your sense of what is acceptable changes. Your body starts responding differently before your life catches up. Then there is a strange middle period where you are still outwardly participating in patterns that no longer match your inward reference point. That gap between inner update and outer continuity is one of the most exhausting phases a person can go through. It is exhausting because every repeated action now contains two realities. There is the action itself, and there is your awareness of its inaccuracy. Before you could move through the pattern with partial unconsciousness, now you cannot. You feel the drag while you are inside the task. You feel the distortion while you are speaking the words. You feel the mismatch while you are being perceived through a version of yourself that is already thinning out. This is why people in this phase often say they feel tired in ways rest does not solve. The fatigue is not only physical, it is the cost of living in split reference. Once you understand that, another implication becomes visible. The goal is not merely to get out of discomfort. The goal is to stop organizing your life around the need to remain divided. That is a very different kind of understanding. It means the issue is not simply which choice feels easier, safer, or more efficient. The issue is which direction reduces internal contradiction and allows participation without fragmentation. Some paths are difficult but coherent. Others are comfortable but corrosive. If you do not learn to feel that distinction, you can easily mistake relief for truth. This is also why rebellion does not always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks like reduced availability. Sometimes it looks like slower responses, fewer explanations, less performance, less eagerness to rescue what is crumbling. Sometimes it looks like silence. You may still be present, still responsible, still functioning, but the old surplus is gone. You are no longer donating the extra energy that once kept everything smooth. That shift can appear minor from the outside, but it is not minor at all. It is often the first visible sign that your life is no longer being upheld by unconscious overextension. And when that overextension ends, reality starts revealing itself more honestly. You see which relationships depended on your self-erasure. You see which systems only worked because you kept overcompensating for what they lacked. You see which identities were sustained through repetition rather than truth. This can feel painful because it removes fantasy from the equation, but it also restores something essential. It restores discernment. Instead of asking how to make everything continue, you begin asking what is actually worthy of continuation. That question matures the rebellion. At first, the process may feel like rejection of the old, but over time it becomes refinement of the real. You are not only learning what to stop feeding, you are learning what deserves your energy now that it is no longer being scattered into maintenance of the misaligned. This is where the experience starts becoming more creative, even before external life fully changes. Space opens, perception sharpens, energy that was trapped in contradiction becomes available for recognition. You start noticing that your future does not only depend on what you build, it also depends on what you stop subsidizing. That is why this phase should not be rushed into premature certainty. There is intelligence in the in-between when you know how to stay with it. The absence of immediate answers does not mean nothing is forming. Often it means something more honest is forming. Something that cannot be built from the old reflex to solve discomfort as quickly as possible. A life built too quickly from panic still carries panic in its foundation. A life built from clearer congruence may take longer to recognize, but it will not require the same level of internal force to maintain. So if you find yourself in this threshold, notice what is becoming impossible to pretend. Notice what now feels costly in a way it did not before. Notice where your energy is withdrawing without your permission and where your attention keeps returning even when you try to dismiss it. These are not random disruptions. They are signals that your inner structure is reorganizing around a deeper standard of participation. And once that standard begins to take hold, you do not simply return to the old life unchanged. You begin to see that what felt like rebellion may have been the earliest form of alignment. Still quiet, still unfinished, but already strong enough to alter what can continue. What often surprises people at this stage is that once the old agreement weakens, life does not immediately replace it with a new certainty. There is usually a period where the false has become visible, but the true has not yet become fully livable. That middle space can feel unproductive from the outside and even frightening from the inside, because the mind is used to measuring progress by visible decisions. But a great deal of real change happens before a decision becomes obvious. It happens in what you can no longer agree to, what you can no longer perform sincerely, and what your system now refuses to normalize. This matters because people often think alignment means instant clarity, when in many cases it first appears as selective incompatibility. You stop fitting places you once fit. You stop speaking with the same tone in conversations that used to come easily. You stop reaching for certain ambitions with the same appetite, not because ambition itself is wrong, but because some desires were tied to versions of yourself you are no longer organized around. This can make you look inconsistent to others. But inconsistency is not always confusion. Sometimes it is evidence that an old internal arrangement has lost authority. That loss of authority changes the way pressure works. Before, pressure may have made you more compliant, more driven, or more willing to override yourself for the sake of completion. Now pressure begins exposing what was hidden inside the pattern. It reveals whether your effort is serving something real or only sustaining an image, a role or a structure that depends on your self-separation. When this becomes visible, the same pressure that once mobilized you can start repelling you instead. Not because you have become weaker, but because your system has become less willing to convert life force into maintenance of what does not belong. This is one reason the rebellion can feel so strange. It does not always arrive as desire for something else. Sometimes it arrives first as refusal to keep financing the wrong thing. That is a different movement. Most people are trained to look for motivation in the form of attraction, vision, excitement, or a clear next step. But deeper change often begins in revocation. Something in you stops extending energy toward what once received it automatically. The future is not fully visible yet, but the old pattern is no longer being fed with the same obedience. If you stay close to that process, you begin to notice that your life has always been shaped not only by what you chose, but by what you continually reinforced. Reinforcement is one of the quiet architects of identity. Every time you return to a pattern, tolerate a distortion, or perform a role without questioning its cost, you are teaching your system what to preserve. Over time, that preservation becomes reality. Not because it is the deepest truth, but because repetition gives it weight, familiarity, and the appearance of necessity. The rebellion begins to interrupt that repetition. Once repetition is interrupted, even slightly, hidden structures start becoming easier to see. You begin noticing how much of your stability came from adaptation rather than congruence. You begin noticing where peace was really numbness, where discipline was really containment, where responsibility was really fear of disruption. None of that means those qualities are false in themselves. It means they may have been carrying more than one function inside your life. What looks virtuous on the surface can still conceal an arrangement that asks you to remain smaller than you are. This is why the experience often becomes more uncomfortable before it becomes more coherent. You are not merely losing an old pattern. You are losing the explanations that made the pattern feel justified. Once those explanations weaken, you can feel exposed. You may realize that some of your choices were never fully chosen. They were inherited, absorbed, rewarded, or built under conditions you no longer live inside. That does not mean you need to judge the past harshly. It means you are finally in a position to see how much of your life was organized before your deeper awareness arrived. And when deeper awareness does arrive, it does not only question what you are doing, it begins questioning what your entire system considers worth preserving. This is where the rebellion moves from mood into structure. It becomes less about temporary frustration and more about revised standards. You start recognizing that certain costs are no longer acceptable, even if they once seemed normal. Certain exchanges no longer feel fair, even if they once felt necessary. Certain environments no longer feel neutral, because you can now feel what they require from you in order to remain there without conflict. That shift in standards affects time, energy, and perception all at once. Time changes because what is misaligned begins to feel longer. Energy changes because what is false begins to feel heavier. Perception changes because what was once invisible becomes obvious. You may find yourself noticing subtle transactions that used to pass under your awareness. The amount of self-editing required in one setting. The amount of emotional labor embedded in one relationship. The amount of fragmentation hidden inside one version of success. These are not minor realizations. They alter what you are willing to call sustainable. When sustainability is redefined, your choices begin changing in ways that may look small but are not small at all. You answer later. You explain less. You stop volunteering extra energy where there is no reciprocity. You become more careful with where your presence goes and what version of you is expected when you arrive. At first, these adjustments can seem almost invisible, but they are not. They are early acts of reorganization. They show that your life is no longer being directed only by habit, fear, or inherited momentum. It is beginning to respond to a more accurate internal measure. Many people try to skip this slower reorganization because they want a cleaner turning point. They want one decision that resolves the entire tension. But the deeper transformation is usually more intelligent than that. It unfolds through repeated acts of non-cooperation with the false. Not dramatic rejection every day, but steady withdrawal of reinforcement. The old life loses power not only when you leave it physically, but when you stop animating it with unconscious loyalty. That is an important distinction. Because outward change without inward withdrawal often recreates the same pattern in a new container. This is also why the in-between can hold so much value, even when it feels unstable. In that space, you start learning the difference between urgency and truth. Urgency says, resolve this now, so the discomfort will stop. Truth says, remain close enough to the process, that you do not build your next life from the same fear that distorted the last one. Urgency wants relief. Truth wants congruence. These two forces can feel similar when you are tired, which is why so many people mistake quick movement for real transition. But movement and transition are not always the same thing. Real transition changes what you can participate in without inner consequence. That is the deeper metric. If a path demands that you become less honest with yourself in order to maintain it, the consequence will eventually show up somewhere. It may appear as exhaustion, resentment, numbness, overcompensation, or chronic hesitation. If a path allows you to remain internally coherent, it may still be difficult, but the difficulty will feel different. It will not ask for constant self-division as the price of continuation. The rebellion is teaching you to feel that distinction more precisely. As that precision develops, another implication becomes visible. You are not only leaving behind what no longer fits, you are becoming someone who can no longer be led by the same mechanisms. Guilt works differently now. Obligation works differently now. The need to be understood by everyone works differently now. Even your relationship with uncertainty begins to change. What once felt like danger may start feeling like space. What once felt like delay may start feeling like incubation. This is how the rebellion matures into discernment. It stops being only a reaction against the old and becomes an education in what is actually true. That education can be humbling because it reveals how often human beings mistake familiarity for rightness. We stay because we recognize the pattern. We repeat because we know the script. We call something stable because we have survived it for a long time. But survival and alignment are not the same. Familiarity and truth are not the same. Repetition and loyalty are not the same. Once these distinctions become real inside you, the entire logic of your life begins quietly reorganizing around them. You may then notice that what you feared as collapse was often exposure. What you feared as loss of direction was often loss of false orientation. What you feared as becoming unreliable was often becoming less available to patterns that required your distortion. This does not make the process instantly easy. It does make it more readable. And when something becomes more readable, it also becomes less likely that you will betray yourself just to end the discomfort of not knowing. So if this threshold still feels unfinished, that does not mean it has failed to do its work. It may mean the work is still moving from recognition into embodiment. It may mean your life is still catching up to what your deeper intelligence has already withdrawn from. It may mean the rebellion is still teaching you what it actually protects, which is not ego, not impulse, not recklessness, but your capacity to stop offering automatic agreement where truth is no longer present. And once that capacity becomes strong enough, the next shape of your life does not have to be forced into existence. It begins assembling itself around what you can finally feel, what you can no longer deny, and what you are becoming too honest to abandon again.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.